Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the January 2018 Coach webinar on reflection and feedback for early achievers coaches. We are so glad you're able to join us today and have many opportunities for participation built into the webinar today. And we are really looking forward to all you have to share. As we move through the material today, please use the chat box to type in your questions. If you select all panelists and attendees or everyone, that way everyone can see the questions that you're asking. We will respond to those questions as appropriate during the webinar and as they relate to the topic presented. There will be time at the end for additional questions as well, and today we have a special panel discussion planned as well. So if you need technical assistance during the webinar, please comment in the chat box, and Mark is online with us today and will be able to provide any technical assistance you need there. And today on the phone, this is me, Kelly DeBoer.
And me, Jen Fung at the University of Washington. Welcome, everybody. So just a quick overview for today's webinar. We will do some announcements. We will talk about some content, and as Kelly mentioned, have lots of opportunities for sharing and participation and reflection when we talk about reflection and feedback. Then we will wrap up with a peer panel and an opportunity to really think deeply about this crucial component of the practice-based coaching cycle of reflection and feedback. A few announcements about upcoming trainings offered through the University of Washington through both Cultivate Learning and the Herring Center. In March, on the 13th and 14th in the Tri-Cities, we'll have a new coach framework training. For those of you who are new coaches and just joining us, welcome. We will have some ERS trainings, an ITERS Deep Dive in Mount Vernon, Washington on February 2nd, and a FICRS Deep Dive in Yakima on March 2nd. We'll have some class trainings upcoming as well, a toddler class reliability training coming up soon on January 18th and 19th here in Seattle, and a pre-K class reliability training in the Tri-Cities on February 15th and 16th. As always, Cultivate Learning maintains a list of all the trainings that are offered for the upcoming year. That lives on their website. And when we send out the PDF document of these slides following the webinar, you will be able to click on the link to see that full list if you haven't viewed it yet. We also have still spaces in our Herring Center 2-day individualization internships. We still have spaces for all of our groups, including CCA coaches, ECAP coaches, and infant toddler consultants. So these are on a first come, first served basis. So if you haven't registered for those 2-day individualization internships that take place here at the Herring Center, please do so. Please check out the registration link.
So great, thank you, Jen. So today we are talking about reflection and feedback, and this reflection and feedback make up the third component in the coaching cycle, and it occurs during the debrief session that follows the focused observation. This component is really important because it supports the implementation of new practices. It guides the precision of new practices, and it provides encouragement and support for the adult learner in the movement toward fluency. During this time, the coach should refer to the action plan before the meeting and throughout the meeting to ensure that the conversation stays focused on the goals and the action steps that were created previously. We know that providing feedback and encouraging thoughtful reflection can be difficult, and some situations make this process even more challenging. It's key that as a coach, you're aware of any preconceived thoughts and ideas you may hold about the individual you're coaching. Research shows that often when we identify someone as challenging or difficult, it may mean that we have an attachment to an idea about that person. And this kind of mindset is not helpful in the coaching relationship. And so if you find yourself drawn to some specific thoughts about an educator before a coaching meeting, challenge yourself to make the assumption that that person is capable of making the necessary changes. Try looking for situations where that educator or provider does the opposite of what you expect. And it's also really important to be aware of your own emotions entering the conversation. You really want your mood to match where you want to go in the conversation and what you're hoping to accomplish. There are strategies and components related to this area that coaches can practice and learn. And some best practices related to providing effective feedback and supporting reflection include using adult learning principles. So during the coaching session, giving examples of when and how the provider demonstrates the targeted practice so they can connect it to what they're already doing. Encourage the provider to try new strategies as soon as possible after they're introduced. And it's important to be aware of how much you're talking during the coaching session. Encourage providers to discuss and reflect on their own practice. Remember, an effective coach is a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage. Coaching is about challenging people to come up with their own answers and solutions. And the more time you can spend asking questions to fully understand their perspective, the more likely the educator will be challenged to come up with their own solutions. Another best practice is to build on the positive. We all like to feel encouraged. So it's really important to notice what is going well, to comment on it, and then build on it. Using a strengths-based approach to coaching can prevent educators from feeling judged. The goal is to work together to become more fluent in existing practices and learn new skills. Be prepared. Keep some helpful phrases handy. Being a coach can leave you at a loss for words at times. So having a few key phrases handy can really help when you're not sure what to say next. Some tried and true favorites include, tell me more about blank, or what can we do to make this practice easier to implement? How do you think circle went today? What have you tried so far? Or using something like I observed and then follow that with what you observed during the observation, or I am curious about. Anchor it. Use data to anchor your observation and feedback. Using data is a way to be objective when providing feedback. You can use assessments that your program is already using, such as the class, the ECHRs, or the ITERs, or consider collecting data on specific behaviors if staff are struggling with a particular child or time of day. Having something to base your coaching on gives focus and makes feedback more objective and meaningful. And regardless of the tool you use, using data to provide some concrete evidence of progress can be very rewarding. And it takes some practice and getting used to, but data can be very powerful. And lastly, provide support. Give materials and ideas to support provider needs. Sometimes offering a material such as a website or a rules poster or just a visual daily schedule at a coaching meeting could be a jump start for a good strategy. Be sure to model what to do with the material you provide. That way it doesn't end up tossed aside and stuck in a drawer instead of being used in the classroom. And avoid providing too many materials at once. That way the provider can focus on what's most important to implement. So think about what's the priority and what do you want to focus on first. So a critical function of the coach is to provide support to providers and educators as they examine and reflect on current practices, develop new skills and competencies, with feedback, and problem-solve challenging situations. So here are some examples of strategies that might be used during feedback sessions. The debriefing session offers a time for the coach to gather provider reflection, provide information, discuss the observation, engage in problem-solving discussion, and other actions that will support the provider with implementation. The strategies listed here are often used by coaches during debrief meetings. So things like reflective conversation. This is an active discussion between the coach and provider with a goal of encouraging the provider to think about their actions, the situations, the strategies used, the responses of the children, and the comfort level regarding implementation of action plans. So during reflective conversation, no corrective or directive statements are used. Instead, the coach offers questions to encourage reflection. Reflective conversations typically focus on perceptions, feelings, interpretations, or use of strategies. Another piece would be problem-solving discussion. This is really a verbal interaction between the coach and provider designed to lead the provider through a systematic process in order to help them identify the problem, to brainstorm and generate solutions, to decide on a possible solution, and implement and evaluate the solution. During debriefing, one or more of the problem-solving process might occur, including identifying the problem, generating options, deciding on solutions, and implementing and evaluating the solution. Video review. The provider and coach review a video segment from the classroom and then engage in one of the coaching strategies, such as problem-solving discussion, reflective conversation, or graphing. Role play is another strategy used here. Role play aims to help the provider learn or practice new techniques during debriefing. So in a role-playing situation, both the coach and the coachee take on a defined role and practice the use of a strategy or response to a situation. And the provider might take on the role of the child while the coach demonstrates a strategy, or the coach might take on the role of the child while the provider practices a strategy. Live demonstration is another technique, and in a live demonstration, the coach enacts the provider's role and provides an example of how to use specific strategies. Video, I know a lot of you use video. The coach may share a short video clip that shows implementation of strategies that are related to the provider's action plan or goals. It may be watching a video through Teachstone if it's specific to class. It might be a recorded video of the teacher working in class with the children and then taking some time to reflect on that. Helping with environmental arrangements, where the coach assists the provider in creating or adapting the environment. This might include preparing or developing materials, making changes in the classroom, or rearranging the physical space. Graphing, the coach assists the provider to display, analyze, or interpret data. So assistance might include creating a graph with the data, interpreting the results of the graph, or teaching the practitioner how to interpret the graph. And providing materials. So the coach offers additional items that might help the provider learn more about specific strategies and other recommended practices, or the coach might provide materials that improve the implementation of specific strategies. So during reflection, when we're talking about reflection, we're really referring to a process that's used by both the coach and provider to formulate thoughts about what is occurring within the classroom. And so while reflection occurs throughout the practice-based coaching cycle, it must always occur prior to providing feedback. And I think this is really key here. During reflection, the coach and provider think about what was observed and compare those observations to the goals and targeted teaching practices that are the foci of the coaching session. As the coach and the provider reflects on observations. They discuss the effectiveness of practice implementation, the interactions between staff and children's responses to the environment, the activities, and the instruction. The reflective process is critical to using observation to identify effective practices, children's responses to instructional efforts, and the success of efforts to improve practice. How well a practice is implemented, providers' confidence in using new practices, and providers' beliefs about how their practices affect child learning. During these reflective conversations or exchanges, the interaction between the coach and the teacher should be reciprocal, positive, and encouraging. And so during reflection, providers should be encouraged to think deeply about their practice and feel safe in sharing their thoughts. And coaches pose reflective questions and then use active listening techniques to encourage the providers to share their observations and ideas. And so during the reflective conversation, the coach poses questions or shares observations and then creates the space and encouragement for the provider to discuss and share reflections. And this is an area where it's really key for the coach to keep asking questions. And even with an educator who's more resistant, maybe, to the coaching efforts, by asking them their ideas, their thoughts, their perceptions, that shows that they're the priority in that moment. And it helps them self-identify different areas. So the coach guides the teacher really to reflect on implementation of practices, while the coach's reflection is informed by the classroom observation. So going back to our previous discussion about collaborative partnership, providers are more likely to open up with the coach to share reflections on their practice if they feel that the coach is a safe person, non-judgmental, and is on their side. And so one way coaches demonstrate this is by maintaining their curiosity. It's really important to be genuinely curious in your questions during these conversations, because we all know educators can tell if you're just asking because you're supposed to. This is where a few prepared questions can be helpful. So think about the what, how, who, where, and when questions here, and avoid the why questions, as they can feel confrontational and judgmental. So reflection can occur in multiple ways. A provider engaged in self-coaching might use a journal to record thoughts about an observation, or they might reflect on a video of their classroom practice by responding to a set of reflective questions. And the coach might take notes or use a checklist of key practices during the observation that provides information to be used by the coach and provider for reflection. Regardless of how or where reflection takes place, the process should be strengths-based and an opportunity for the coach to affirm and acknowledge the provider's implementation efforts. Reflection occurs through reciprocal conversations, with both the coach and teacher offering reflective statements. And so reflection is prompted with open-ended questions that encourage the teacher to think about practice implementation and perspectives. And the feedback's structured based on the observation, so it's really concrete. It's, I observed this. The coach also offers reflection on what was observed. Feedback is connected to the action plan. And during reflection, educators are encouraged to identify challenges that are impeding their use of a practice, as well as identify things that are going well. And so the coach's responses to statements of challenges should convey support related to the provider's efforts and address challenges along with feedback.
Okay, great. So now we'd like to hear from you. Just a quick reminder that in your Zoom webinar chat box, there's a drop-down menu in the To field. It should be right above where it says Type Message Here. We want to make sure that in that To field, you are selecting all panelists and attendees, or everyone. I think the default is to come to all panelists, and then only Kelly and Mark and I see it. And we want to make sure that everyone is able to see the questions and the comment and the great suggestions that people are offering. So go ahead, Kelly. Sorry, I just wanted to.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you. So, you know, now's our opportunity. We want to ask you a few questions. So we know that, you know, reflection occurs through conversations between the coach and the provider, and that the coach facilitates that process by asking questions. Coaches use objective questions to prompt the provider to reflect on what happened, or interpretive questions to encourage the provider to reflect and draw conclusions about observations, and comparative questions to support the provider in evaluating events and interactions. So we'd love to hear from you all. What are some questions that you use as a coach to encourage more deep, meaningful reflection by providers? Like, what are your go-to questions? And please share in the chat box.
I'm seeing lots of responses come through from Jennifer and E. Snyder and B. Tyler. Just a reminder, those are looking like they're just coming to all panelists, so be sure to select all panelists and attendees, or everyone. We will read the comments as people type them.
I'll go ahead and start reading them, Jen. So it looks like a question, one coach asked, what excites you about the practice you are putting into place, or what excites you about the goal you're working on? Sometimes I will ask an individual what a certain skill or behavior has looked like for them in the past. Let's think about the ways you might handle that situation. What would happen if? I wonder how. How did that feel for you? The questions depend on what is happening, and it has to be natural. Yes, that is the key. It's that skill of maintaining your authentic curiosity during reflective time. What do you see this looking like? What do you want to achieve from? How would that look for you? What would it take to get there? Tell me more. I observed. I see you are working on. I'm curious about. How did that work for you? What support would you like? Tell me more about that, or how is that working for you? Lots of tell me more. That's a great piece to dig deeper with a coachee. Tell me more about that. What would your ideal practice look like? What do you feel is preventing you from? What are some other ways of looking at this? Would your practice change if parents were in the room? How can I support you best with? Lots of great questions here. What do you find most valuable about this activity? What do you see as options? How can I support you? In a perfect world, what would you like to see? What would it take to get there? One question I always found helpful too at the start of an observation debrief was like, how was this day? Was this a typical day? What was different? How do you feel about what we did today? What do you think would help you accomplish this? What is your vision for? Is this helpful? Someone else commented, I love the idea of would your practice change if parents were in their room? It's a great one. Yeah. How would that change? And often reflecting back on what you hear them say, which causes them to reflect further or deeper. Yes, reflection is really a combination of those reflective listening statements where you're reflecting back what you heard them say, and a combination of asking those open-ended questions to dig deeper. So doing both. If I wasn't in the room observing, would you have transitioned to another lesson? One coach shares she's striving to use genuine and individualized questions to have a personalized conversation so it doesn't feel too formal or too canned. Absolutely, that's that part we talked about a little bit ago about that, having those authentic questions. It's helpful to have a few when you get stuck, a few handy questions to pull from, but definitely you have to maintain your authenticity throughout the conversation. Thank you. So as people are sharing, we can go to the next slide, Jen, that has
a reflection starter phrase.
All the,
yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Oh, you're there. Okay. So encouraging reflection through specific open-ended questions. The types of questions coaches might use include objective questions that prompt the teacher to recall implementation efforts or remember the impact of their efforts on the children or the lesson. You know, what happened when you showed Devin the number line? Interpretive questions might also be used to encourage teachers to share their perceptions about events and actions. So what do you think would happen if Benji was the morning helper? Or why do you think Aaron and Malia didn't line up this morning? Comparative questions help the teacher to be reflective about what occurred and draw conclusions that might support implementation efforts. So how did today's science experiment compare to last week's? All great ideas. So, and the more you can ask reflective questions, especially with those educators who are struggling and maybe having difficulty reflecting on their own practice or identifying the areas they need to work on, the more time you can spend in this reflection phase, the more likely the educator is to come up with their own solutions to the issues. So now we're going to do a brief case presentation. We have Patty Shastani from TCA of Washington, and Patty has been an early achievers coach for 3 years in Eastern Washington, as well as an early learning professional for 30 years. And so she coaches a wide variety of child care centers and family child cares, and some of the programs are blended ECAP and early Head Start sites as well. So welcome, Patty.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Did you want me to just go ahead and tell
that would be great if you share your example about how you used reflection to really help change providers' practice.
Okay, great. I guess first is really setting that foundation of building that relationship with the teacher. And this is a teacher who I had really only been working with for a few months at this point. But I knew that she came from an elementary school background and that really preparing children for kindergarten was like her foremost value. She wanted to really make sure the children that she was serving were well equipped to go into kindergarten. So she brought a lot of typical elementary style teaching to what she was doing with the younger children, and really did a lot of large group instruction was something that she was doing a lot of. And she was actually pretty effective doing that because she really, she really had a clear plan. She would have a lot of visuals for the children to look at and see, and a lot of different ways to engage them. Though what did happen though was that while she was really kind of adapting the instruction to children in that large group, it was pretty limited what she could really provide for any one child. They really would only get a couple moments that were really very focused on them individually. So that was one of the pieces that I was hoping to have her think about when we met. And so I thought about what can I ask her to help her think about that. And I had already had some success with her. She was familiar with the class tool and really respected that as a tool because of all the research behind it. And so when we did meet, I asked her, first I made note of all those things I just talked about, what really worked well with her large group meeting, and then asked her, or told her that I noticed that, her children were really at different places as far as their ability to really understand the concept she was presenting, and that I saw her really adapt for those kids. And then I just said, but I wonder if you were doing that very same activity in smaller groups, if you would be able to provide more support for those children in developing those skills. And I often also will sort of make the parallel of how when we get to sit down and coach, when I get to sit down with a teacher and coach them, I can really individualize with them. And I ask them to compare that if instead of doing that, I just had a room full of 20 teachers and was trying to discuss the same thing. But she was very receptive, and she really saw that as something that she was willing to try. And this is a teacher that once she decides that's what she's going to do, she puts right into implementation. So yeah, that was one example with her.
Great, thank you, Patty. If anyone has any questions or comments for Patty about this specific situation where she used reflection and feedback to improve and change providers' practice, please use the chat box. If anyone thinks, as we continue to move through the content, if anyone thinks of any questions for Patty, please feel free to continue to use the chat box, but we will move on to the next section. So Kelly talked a lot about reflection. You all shared some really great suggestions and starter phrases that you use to really encourage deep and meaningful reflection with the providers that you're coaching. But we know that reflection is a first step, but really in order to change someone's practice and try new things or use something more often or really meet that goal of practice-based coaching of improving practice to improve outcomes for kids, we know that reflection isn't the only step, that we also need to use feedback. But feedback, just like reflection can be an art, using feedback effectively can also be an art form. So we'd like to hear from you again. Please use the chat box to share what steps do you take when you're preparing for your debrief meeting. What steps do you take to ensure that the feedback that you will provide to your providers is as useful as possible to the providers that you're coaching? What type of feedback? How do you plan for a debrief session? But really, how do you ensure that your feedback will be as effective as possible in changing someone's practice? See, Jennifer is saying that she really likes to use best practice for objective observations and start with the phrase, "I noticed," and ask if they noticed the same thing. Carmen is saying that she really likes to make sure that feedback is grounded in data, feedback is relevant to someone's goal, and that feedback highlights strengths of the provider or the teacher. Someone else is responding to be very detailed and bring examples, that the feedback provided isn't too broad. That going back to the mutually agreed upon goal or focus of coaching, even before the observation. So really thinking about what we talked about initially with building those collaborative partnerships and making sure that both coach and provider have a mutual and shared understanding about what the process and the outcome of the coaching process and relationship will look like. I look for it when I observe again and follow up with them. When I see or hear from them next, how did it go? I observed. Someone else reporting that they share specific examples and quotes, for example, which open-ended questions the teacher asked. So really grounding feedback in concrete data that was collected during the observation. Jan is reporting that she likes to plan feedback so it's balanced, starting with supportive statements and then embedding some instructive feedback to support improvement in practice. Making sure that feedback is related to the goal, making sure to give examples on the strengths and focus on the positive. Also sharing data about and feedback about how the provider is progressing towards their goal. Incorporate the coachee's idea. Know how your observations support the goal. Review the target observation beforehand and decide on what to highlight. And think about open-ended questions that would encourage reflection. Someone else is saying that they like to pay attention to their tone and be aware of body language so that you can ensure that your feedback is received as openly as possible. That's great. Focus on positive feedback and how we can do more of it and extend on what they're doing well. Lori says, first review the previous communication as a starting point for the next conversation and formulate a few questions to move forward on a goal. These are all really great tips about how you are intentional in planning for these debrief sessions so that your feedback can be as effective and meaningful as possible to the providers you're working with. Thank you so much. So thinking about effective feedback, just like with reflection, there are some best practices and recommendations when it comes to providing feedback that is effective as possible in meeting our goal as coaches of really improving and changing and building on the use of providers' evidence-based practices. So a good reflective conversation will assist the provider to deliver their own feedback, which is very powerful in helping to create independent and effective providers. Once the provider engages in reflection, the coach can provide feedback to the provider about what they observed, the quality with which practices were implemented, or the practices that might need improvement or to be done differently. As a coach prepares for the debrief session, you should really be thinking about what type of feedback will be provided as well as how it will be framed and phrased. So we know that the provision of feedback must be intentional, as you've all demonstrated and talked about. When delivering feedback, the feedback should be direct, The coach should use first-person language and be as precise as possible, such as, you stopped in the story and expanded on what Jimmy pointed out, versus you were very responsive to the children during story time. When planning for feedback that will be provided during the debrief session, we should also be thinking about how the feedback will be phrased in order to ensure that it is received as openly as possible and that the feedback is as effective as possible. When we're thinking about what type or the phrasing of the feedback, one thing that we can think about is whether or not the feedback is attributive or whether it is non-attributive. So for example, feedback about the same observed activity can be phrased in different ways, which might really have an effect on how the provider receives the feedback. Using attributive feedback, it's important to make sure that your feedback about what providers is about what providers are doing rather than the attributes of the provider. Attributive feedback focuses on the provider's internal qualities rather than how they implemented the practice. So general statements that are attributive really do little to help the provider grow in implementing their action plans and their goals more effectively. Statements that are attributive and complementary to providers can be used. However, they must be paired with the more powerful non-attributive feedback. So non-attributive feedback is feedback that's based on specific observed events and behaviors. And this is much more powerful, and we know it's more likely to result in permanent change on the part of the adult learner. So for example, if I am hiring a coach to help me with my tennis serve, what kind of feedback might I be looking for from that coach? Feedback from them such as looking good or great effort or I like that, while it might make me feel good, it is not likely to help me make my serve better. It's not likely to make me a better player. So while I might like to hear the compliments, I would like to hear more concrete advice about how I can actually make my tennis serve better and more powerful. So thinking about attributive versus non-attributive feedback, as a coach, we might think we're communicating one thing, for example, the use of the attributive term thoughtful, but the provider may think that thoughtful means something different. So really emphasizing that use of the non-attributive feedback that's more specific, that's more objective, and really gives the provider something to change or something to build off of. In addition to thinking about how the feedback is phrased or framed, we also want to think about the type of feedback that we're providing. There are two types of feedback that we know are essential to the practice-based coaching project: supportive feedback and constructive feedback. Both supportive feedback and constructive feedback provided with the intention of helping providers understand their actions and their relationship to the action plan goals and how to implement practices with more fluency, more precision, or with more effectiveness. So supportive feedback refers to commenting on the provider's correct implementation of the coach skill or the target skill. It goes beyond saying, "You did so great, keep it up," by providing more specificity. And like you all have commented in the chat box, by connecting the observation with the action plan goal and steps and the focus on the coaching session. So good supportive feedback provides the provider with concrete evidence of their progress towards the action plan and goal. Constructive feedback is really provided to help educators expand or adjust their practice and really to do something differently. It's delivered to assist providers in understanding where they might have missed an implementation opportunity or how to improve implementation of a targeted teaching practice. The coach should be specific and precise about what can be improved upon and how to make those improvements. It's very important for us to reflect carefully on how to frame and deliver constructive feedback, and this can be one of the most challenging parts of a coaching relationship. Constructive feedback is best delivered in a trusting relationship because the recipient may easily misinterpret the feedback as judgmental or evaluative. So thinking about supportive feedback that's more specific, that goes beyond that kind of attributive feedback that talks more generally about someone's qualities as a teacher or a person, but thinking about good supportive feedback that is objective and lets people know where they can expand and build upon what they're already doing. So some examples of some supportive feedback starter phrases: you really got it when you did this. I noticed that you did that and this was the result. It was great to see you do this. So some really specific examples of behaviors that providers are using and connecting those back to the action plan and the goals. I also really like that some of these examples and also some of the reflective prompts encouraged providers to notice and think about not only what they did, but also how children responded, and really thinking about what was the effect on my classroom and my children when I used this target practice, or likewise when I didn't use this target practice. Thinking about feedback and thinking about the debrief sessions, many people have mentioned that they like to collect data during the observation, some kind of data on the provider's use of a specific practice during an observed session. And data-based feedback is a great example of a type of feedback where you can use both supportive and constructive feedback. So data-based feedback can yield very powerful change. We know that data-based feedback is objective and is really anchored in the provider's practice that we're observing. The data that we're collecting and reflecting on can come from many different sources. It might come from the use of an observation tool, such as the class or the ECHRS, or it might be by recording data that are related to a specific action plan goal. We should collect data in this matter only if the providers know that data will be collected and shared with them, and if they agree that this will be the focus of the observation. After data are collected, it might be helpful to summarize the data on graphs to really help providers quickly identify trends in their improvement in the use of practices, or to help identify areas that might need improvement or additional implementation effort. Once the data are shared, both the coach and the provider will engage in careful reflection to come to conclusions about the data. Very often, a review of the data will result in revisions or additions to a coaching plan goals or the activities to help achieve those goals. As an example of what summarized data might look like, here is an example of some data from an assessment tool that examines teacher implementation of social emotional teaching practices. So these data summarized here depict two different points in time that the coach has observed and collected data using this observation tool, and are summarized in this very clear graph that clearly depicts to providers where they'll be able to see their areas of growth. This kind of data is a great way to show growth and identify areas that might need more focus. The sharing of visual, objective evidence of the progress of a provider has made can be very motivating to them to continue to participate in the coaching cycle, to put effort towards improving their practice in targeted areas. As mentioned, database feedback is just one type of feedback that can be used during the debrief meeting. And as Kelly described, many other coaching strategies during the debrief meeting can be used, such as role play, demonstration that can be used to help change provider behavior. And the type of coaching strategy that we're using should really be intentionally selected based on the provider's goals, their preferences, and their learning style. So turning it back over to the group, what types of feedback do you find yourself using during a debrief session? What are your most powerful types of feedback? Are you using data-based feedback? Are you using role play? Are you using environmental arrangement support? Please use the chat box to share with all attendees what kind of powerful, effective feedback types are you using during your coaching sessions? So I'd see Jennifer responding that pictures and video really help to show the behavior in action. So using video review to help providers reflect on the teaching practices that they are using. Data to help show changes over time. Strengths-based video review, be very powerful. So yes, reviewing alongside it. It's different to hear about someone's observations of you than to observe your own teaching. And that can be a really powerful tool for providers who are comfortable and agree to that type of coaching strategy. Someone expanding on and agreeing, I use video reflection for providers to reflect on, but making sure that it's relevant to their goal. Data and quotes about what providers' conversations with children sound like. So some really direct examples of what providers are saying. Constructive feedback and positive feedback, right? So a balance of both of those really powerful types of feedback. Video review, modeling specific target practices, sharing specifics of what is observed. Great, thank you everybody. Please, as always, continue to share in the chat box as questions or thoughts pop into your mind as we continue to move through the slides. So now we have another coach on the call who has agreed to share her experiences and do a case presentation on how she's really found a way to provide effective feedback with teachers and providers. So I'd like to introduce Susan Patterson, who is an ECAP coach in the Selah School District, which is in the Yakima Valley. Susan is coaching at the Robert Lintz Early Learning Center, which has 5 a.m. classes and 4 p.m. classes. Out of the 120 spots at the Early Learning Center, about 65 spots are ECAP spots. The rest are Title I funded, special education spots, and tuition funded spots. And because Susan is coaching as part of a school district, she wears several hats in addition to being a coach. She also helps coordinate their P3 alignment for the district. So thank you, Susan, for sharing your case presentation on how you provide effective feedback.
Hello, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate being invited to share what we've been doing here. The case study that I wanted to share with you came out of our own feedback from our site visit when we were rated for early achievers. And so our problem of practice was in the instructional supports from class. So that became an area that I decided I'd like to focus on for the whole program across all of our classrooms. I thought one of the best ways to really provide more learning opportunities for all kids if all staff had better interactions with students. And we did pretty well with language modeling, but the 2 areas that we were the lowest in, predictably, were in concept development and quality of feedback. So I'm fortunate to be able to provide professional development to the staff as well. So I used a lot of the Teachstone materials and videos to really create a common foundation and understanding of what each of those domains look like. And I created some templates using the class materials and just modified them to for the staff to also do observations from the videos where they were looking for the behavioral indicators and recording them. And so they had some practice in all of this. And then my goal then was to follow up by providing feedback as they implemented those interactions in the classroom. And the way that I did that is I created a mini kind of half sheet written feedback tool. And I was committed to going into every classroom each week for a minimum of 20 minutes. And I alternated morning sessions and afternoon sessions and different times of the day. And so for each of those 20 minutes, I just recorded what evidence I did see that was evidence of concept development and evidence of quality of feedback. And I recorded those on the same observation sheet that they had practice with, and then I copied over just good examples onto the feedback sheet that I put in the teachers' mailboxes. So they got the written feedback immediately, and I also rated it. I rated it whether the evidence fell in the low, medium, or high. And I did that by circling numbers. And those of you familiar with class kind of know what that looks like. But what that gave them was a real concrete way that they could see whether or not they were improving with effort and changing some of their interactions. And over time, they did see changes in how the amount of evidence that I was able to collect. But some of the most positive parts of the feedback came with my conversations with their classroom teams. So although I would give them immediately the written feedback, I also, we have one day a week without students, and I've asked them to meet as a classroom team on those days. So I would join with their team on one of those Mondays a month, and I would go over the written feedback, and I would just talk about it from a more shared experience of being in the classroom and knowing kind of the energy of the kids and what was going on, and talk to them about some of the missed opportunities where something could have been a little bit different and it would have really made a difference in either quality of feedback or the concept development domains. So for example, in one of the classrooms, the assistant teacher had put out a tub of Play-Doh, and in this instance she told them, you know, okay, there's 3 of you, so you're going to, so you need to, we need to divide it up into 3 parts so everybody has enough. And I talked with them and said, what would have happened if instead of you solving the problem for them, you had posed it as, oh, there's 3 of you, what will we do? And then, you know, supported them through figuring out how they could divide up the Play-Doh. And I said, just that kind of a tweak can change the amount of thinking and investment that children have in figuring it out. And you can see when you have those conversations, you can see light bulbs go off, and actually a sense of pride, because that's an easy thing to do and to change. And I heard back from that individual how much, you know, that changed the way she thought about a lot of the little tasks that she does now and how she phrases what she does. So those conversations and the written feedback has, across all of the classrooms, really increased the quality of the interactions that all of the staff are having. And what I like about how this has worked is, you know, like in any coaching situation, if you're clear on your target, so for me, laying the foundation with the professional development, so we all had a real shared understanding, and then the feedback was directly related to something that we were all talking about, I think really bolstered their teamwork also, their professional learning community, because we're all having similar conversations. It also, I did this over the course of 3 months. I also could then begin to see some trends and why there were some teachers that struggled more than others. And that then became you know, I could change my emphasis and change my focus a little bit with those teachers. So that's generally what I wanted to share.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Susan. As people think of questions or comments for Susan, please continue to use the chat box as we move through the remainder of the content on the webinar.
So we know how challenging it can be to come up with the right words to say when offering constructive feedback. And so one key to doing it well is to really be as prepared as possible. And we've been talking about that as we've gone through the previous slides here, preparing ahead of time, having some go-to questions, conversation starters, having some data prepared and looked at. So when providing constructive feedback, it's best to start with what you observed regarding the targeted teaching practice. So focus specifically on what you saw the provider and the children do. Using quotes, as some coaches have mentioned here, quotes from the classroom. What did the teacher say? How did the child respond? Give information and suggestions for improving the practice. An important part of coaching is providing information to increase the provider's knowledge of the practice and suggesting strategies for implementation. Excuse me. Be specific with what can be improved and how to make those improvements. Ask the provider to reflect on additional ways to improve the practice. Providers build confidence and competence when they have the opportunity to reflect on and brainstorm strategies rather than being told what to do and how to do it. They are also, as we talked about, they're also more likely to integrate these strategies into their practice if they have input and buy-in. Provide resources to support that implementation. So take the time to search for and provide resources that can help that educator improve their practice. So maybe it's sending them a link to a video in Teachstone. Maybe it's sending them an article that is focused around what the targeted practice is. Some constructive feedback offers an opportunity to support implementation of the action plan, but sometimes we know it can be a sticky situation. This is a chance for coaches and providers to problem solve together and for coaches to offer suggestions, tips, or insights about practices. And so as Jen mentioned, constructive feedback it's not evaluative or punitive, and it really happens in the context of that collaborative partnership and should be a comfortable process for all people involved. Sometimes that constructive feedback may be difficult to deliver. Nevertheless, these conversations must happen if you really want the coaching process to be effective. And so when you are meeting resistance, when you are sensing that the educators having difficulty moving forward with the information, that's when it's good to pause and ask a few more reflective questions. So that reflection and feedback cycle is pretty continuous. So you may need to step back and do some more reflection to find out what is happening. You know, notice the body language, notice the feeling in the room, if you will, as you're going through the feedback. And so that said, what parts of reflection and feedback are most challenging for you as a coach? We'd love for you to use the chat box to share. And we wanted to know what the most challenging pieces are. I see Jan says that it's important not to assume knowledge, understanding, and or lack thereof. This is why brainstorming together is effective. And I see that April did make a comment above. And I believe it was talking about when you had some difficult when you observed a negative climate, or the coachee doesn't agree with the observation or just didn't try to implement the goal upon the observation, that's when you're going to go back to those reflective statements, the tell me more about this, or I'm really curious to hear this, or I noticed during the observation that this didn't happen. Tell me more about that. Someone's saying when staff are not invested or rolling eyes or feel they're not receptive, you know, trying to break down the walls. So that's when you go back to that questioning, the open-ended questions, and then reflecting back what you're hearing them say. A lot of those motivational interviewing techniques that you've had. Some other challenging pieces are when teachers don't talk. We have a few that have a hard time reflecting and giving feedback. When the person talks over you and does not join the conversation and continues to be negative. So how do you flip it in that situation? What questions do you ask that educator in that moment to help shift their perspective from the negative to maybe seeing a different point of view? Some other challenges, getting teachers to express their thoughts, or when they're very quiet or they just say, I don't know. Some challenges setting the stage for a constructive conversation. And some are challenged in the waiting for the coachee to offer their ideas or solutions before jumping in with my own. Adequate pause time. That's very important in the reflective process and often hard to do. When hearing difficult information or addressing concerns, I've had folks who change the subject. This makes it hard to stay on task as the topic changes can be subtle. Another coach saying the most difficult part of reflection and feedback is bringing up a negative climate observation or a challenging conversation. When directors are super defensive about observation feedback, when they were not in the room during observation. Rolling with the resistance. Don't argue, but find out more about why they feel that way. Pause time is so big. Yes. Well, keep your comments coming in. We're going to move on to having difficult conversations.
So building on what Kelly said and a lot of the challenges that are being expressed and brought up in the chat box, we know the best practices around how to conduct an observation and how to tie the feedback to the observation and what types of feedback we should be providing. But sometimes even when we're the most prepared, something about the conversation, whether it's the mindset of the provider or the director or the type of feedback that's being shared, but something about the conversation makes it exceptionally difficult. So there are many reasons why a conversation may be perceived as difficult. In research related to these difficult, or as some people refer to them, crucial conversations, there are some situations that can predict if a conversation will kind of escalate and become especially difficult. This includes when stakeholders have opposing opinions about something, when there are very strongly held emotions regarding a topic, and when the stakes surrounding a conversation are high. As we often know from coaches, the ratings process and the process of coaching for quality improvement can occasion and create these kind of tense and crucial situations. And we know that this can make the task of coaching, especially when it comes to sharing constructive feedback or feedback that might be perceived as negative with providers and directors. There is also a lot of research on people's reactions to difficult conversations, including the facilitator of the conversation as well as the recipient of the information. And we also know, though, that there are suggestions that we as the facilitator of the conversation can use to help improve the quality and productivity of these conversations, really with an emphasis on creating and maintaining dialogue. These tips won't necessarily make these conversations easier per se, but can help keep the conversation focused on the goals and the ultimate outcome, which we know in our case are improving the quality of care and teaching to improve outcomes for children. So strategies for approaching difficult conversations can be found from many different sources. I see somebody recommending a book called Fierce Conversations that they've used and found helpful. And one really widely shared and really well-respected resource is a book called Crucial Conversations, which is where a lot of this information and the suggestions that we'll provide today on the processes, they're based on recommendations from Crucial Conversations. So there are some tips that Crucial Conversations provides when thinking about how to prepare for or react, really, prepare ourselves to react during these difficult conversations that may arise. So when we talked about when discussing effective feedback, the first recommendation is really to focus on the observed behavior, not the purpose, not the person. We really want to remember that the purpose of constructive feedback is to change practice that providers may be using incorrectly, or even to have them in some cases eliminate the use of strategies or behaviors that might be counterproductive. I've seen lots of people mention difficulty sharing feedback around negative climate during observations. If the individual that we're providing feedback to perceives that they're being attacked personally, they will very quickly turn defensive, and this opportunity for a meaningful discussion may be lost. Another recommended practice is to make negative feedback unusual. So as much as possible, we discuss the use of a strengths-based approach as a best practice in debriefing and supporting reflection and providing feedback. This is a recommendation related to making difficult conversations as productive as possible and to share difficult feedback. We know that if someone perceives they're frequently being judged or criticized, there is a tendency to stop caring about their performance and to stop putting in the effort towards meeting and making progress towards their goals, because they might feel that whatever they do, they're going to get raked over the coals, so to speak. Another recommendation really is to be timely. So not only do we know that feedback is most effective when it's tied to a specific goal and provided in real time or as soon as possible following an observation, we also know that changes in behavior are more easily achieved when negative feedback is administered in small doses. Even if we feel like we're waiting for the right moment to share constructive feedback, we know that if we wait, there might be a tendency to kind of pile on several instances of feedback at the same time, and that the recipients of the feedback can become easily overwhelmed if they receive several instances of feedback, particularly constructive feedback, at once. It also, we know from adult learning, that it can be difficult to connect the feedback provided at the quote right moment at a later time to a specific instance of behavior, which would make change much more difficult and frustrating for the provider. The recommendation about coaching the behavior you want to see, we talk a lot about this. Constructive feedback is useless without a model for how to do it better or how to do it differently. But in many cases, simply telling the other person what to do or how to do it, it can be a waste of your time as well as the learner's time. Someone mentioned in the chat box earlier, I don't always want to assume that they know how to use the practice that I'm talking about. I want to really reflect with them on what their knowledge is about this practice, and then moving forward, how can I help them to become to have this practice become their own, and how can I help them to really learn it and use it fluently. Several people mentioned this as a challenge when we were talking about what's the most difficult part about reflection and sharing feedback. Making space for the other person to speak and to contribute to the conversation. So stop talking and invite the other person to engage. So during crucial conversations, we really want to work towards the goal of establishing dialogue, which is the two-way sharing of information and really creating shared meaning between the participants of the conversation. So each of us enters conversations with our own opinions, our own feelings, our own knowledge, our own beliefs, and our own experiences around the topic at hand. The unique combination of our thoughts and feelings makes up what Crucial Conversations refers to as our own pool of meaning, our personal pool of meaning. So the pool not only informs us, but it really drives our every action, what we say, how we react, and what we do. When we enter a crucial or a difficult conversation, by definition, the members of the conversation don't share the same pool of meaning. Our opinions might differ. What we know is that, we're not necessarily going to be able to prevent those situations where people have different pools of meaning or pools of knowledge, but we know that people who are skilled at dialogue and who are skilled at navigating crucial conversations do their best to make it safe for everyone to add their own meaning to a pool to create what Crucial Conversation refers to as the shared pool. So if we are encountering those situations where we're not seeing eye to eye on what a goal is or what a practice does or doesn't look like in the classroom, that's where we as facilitators can really stop and say, okay, we're recognizing that our meaning, our pool of meaning around this topic, around this content is not the same. And for myself as the facilitator, I'm going to do everything I can to really invite people to participate in creating that shared pool of meaning. So even ideas that might seem controversial or wrong or at odds with our own beliefs, we want to invite people to share those. So obviously, we're not going to agree with every idea, but we want to do our best to ensure that all ideas find their way into the open. So after we've provided constructive feedback on specific and recent actions, if we perceive that this conversation is moving towards the crucial or difficult territory, then that's when we want to stop talking. And we want to give the other person a chance to respond to your statements and to ask clarifying questions about the information that you've provided. Most people can't learn unless they first feel that they've been heard out. The feedback process will be more effective if you understand how the other person really perceives the situation and you have an understanding of their experience. On the flip side, when someone doesn't feel heard, when their ideas or thoughts or concerns remain in their heads and their opinions never make it into that shared pool, they are much more likely to resist or sit back quietly during difficult or touchy conversations. And it makes it really difficult to fully engage in this process of practice-based coaching, of sharing goals, of reflecting on feedback. And it really affects the recipient's ability to accept feedback and new information, which we know are necessary for adult learning and behavior change. So asking questions such as, why did you approach the situation in this way? Or what is your thought process? Or some of those other really great reflective questions about not only the content and the practice, but about their feelings and perceptions and experiences with the content and with teaching and providing care for young children, really getting at understanding what's making this difficult, what's making us not share the same pool of information. So asking these questions not only provides you perspective and adds to the pool of meaning, but can lead to other people discovering their own solutions and their own insights. So really the skills that people who learn to navigate these crucial conversations, one of the skills that people develop is really learning to look. So as people begin to feel unsafe, they'll oftentimes start down sort of an unhealthy or unproductive path of communication by moving either to what Crucial Conversations refers to as silence or violence. So moving to silence results in a person withholding meaning from the shared pool. Silence is almost always done as a means of avoiding potential problems. The three most common forms of silence are masking, avoiding, and withdrawing. Masking consists of understating or selectively showing our true opinion. Sarcasm or sugarcoating are also some of the most popular forms of withdrawing or masking their true opinion. Avoiding involves steering or completely away from sensitive subjects, changing the subject. We talk, but really without addressing the real issues. Withdrawing means pulling out of a conversation altogether. We exit the conversation, end the conversation, or maybe even exit the room. Some people in an area or in a conversation where they feel unsafe may use these silence behaviors, while some others might move to what Crucial Conversations refers to as violence, or trying to force meaning into the pool. So violence behaviors consist of any verbal strategy that attempts to convince, control, or compel others to accept their point of view. The three most common forms of this type of communication reaction are controlling, labeling, and attacking. Controlling consists of coercing others into your way of thinking. This includes cutting others off, overstating facts, speaking in absolutes, changing subjects, or using directive questions to control the conversations. Labeling is putting a label on someone or on an idea so they can be dismissed under a general stereotype or category. Attacking includes belittling or threatening. So, as I mentioned, one of the key skills that people who learn to successfully navigate these crucial conversations, one of the key skills that these people learn is to look for not only the reaction of others, but as well as your own reaction during difficult conversations. Then really attempt to step out of the content of the conversation, stop that part, and start to make it safe for everyone to share. Don't stay stuck in what's being said. When thinking about how to make a conversation safe and make it safe for participants to create and add to that shared pool of meaning, Crucial Conversations really recommends asking yourself some questions about how the other person may be perceiving the safety of the conversation. So asking yourself, do they perceive that we share the same mutual purpose in this conversation and in this coaching process? Do they believe that you care about their goals in this process and in this conversation? Do they trust your motives? And also thinking about mutual respect. Do they believe that you respect them? So when we're thinking about Crucial Conversations and some specific tips and strategies for how to navigate and really facilitate conversations when they become difficult or high stakes, thinking about how to encourage others to share their paths and share information and make it safe for them to contribute to that shared pool of meaning, Crucial Conversation recommends a strategy that they call AMP. This strategy employs 4 powerful listening tools that can help make it safe for other people to speak frankly. These 4 skills are called power listening tools because they're best remembered with the acronym AMP: ask, mirror, paraphrase, and prime. Luckily, the tools that these recommendations work for both silence and violence reactions in others. So thinking about ask to get this new conversation started. Simply start by expressing interest in the other person's views. Mirror, to confirm feelings. So increase the safety, the feelings of safety by respectfully acknowledging the emotions that other people appear to be feeling. P, paraphrase, to acknowledge the story or the meaning. As others begin to share their perspectives and their part of the story that will become the shared pool of meaning, restate what you've heard them say to show not just that you are interested, but that it's safe for them to say what they're thinking. And then if you're getting nowhere, prime. If others continue to hold back, take your best guess as to what they might be thinking and feeling and ask for their response on your guess. It seems to me like you might be feeling this way. Am I correct? And then thinking about after you've encouraged others to share their thoughts and perceptions using those powerful listening tools, you'll need to respond as well. So what happens if you disagree or some of the other person's facts are what you perceive as wrong or incorrect? So thinking about as you begin to share your views, Crucial Conversation encourages the facilitator to remember their ABCs and use the following strategies. So agree. If you hear somebody express an opinion or a belief or an experience that you agree with, definitely agree with them. State your agreement and build on that shared pool of meaning. Build. If others leave something out, agree when you do, but then add more information. Build on what information or what may have been left out. And then compare. When you do differ significantly, don't automatically suggest that the other is wrong, but work to compare the two views. So while we know that this process of dialogue, of supporting and facilitating the adding of meaning to the pool is important, and it can bring conversations that are difficult, hopefully back to being more productive and constructive, this isn't the end of the conversation. A decision still must be made as to how to move forward, what goal will be focused on, how the goal will be achieved, and so on. So we know that having a clear established process for coaching, having those strong collaborative partnerships, and making sure that people understand that both coach and provider know from the beginning how decisions will be made regarding creating shared goals. Having this agreement will be powerful to refer back to during this process of, okay, now we feel safe, we feel heard, we are working towards creating a more shared pool of meaning. I understand where you're coming from, but we know that's not the end of the conversation. Where do we need to go next? And last, Crucial Conversation recommends that while these strategies and these suggestions are tested and they've proven to be effective, that being skilled at facilitating dialogue and successfully navigating these crucial conversations is a skill that just takes practice. Crucial Conversation notes that the people who become best at dialogue not only practice these conversations, but they also continuously examine their own communication styles, their habits, and their patterns, and commit to the principle of work on me first. Although there may be exceptions, definitely some conversations, more often than not, when a conversation becomes difficult or crucial, there's likely something that we have done to contribute to the problems that we might be experiencing. When conversations become crucial or difficult, we know that we fall back on our own communication patterns and habits as well. So those who make the commitment to work on me first realize that not only are they likely to benefit by improving their own approach to communication, but really that's all that we have control over, is how we communicate, not how someone else reacts. So we know from experience that those who continuously work on their communication styles, their reactions, and practicing the skills that support dialogue become the most skilled at navigating these crucial conversations. Okay, so we are actually out of time. Kelly, do you think that maybe we could wrap up with the rest of our announcements and then maybe send out our questions that we had for people to reflect on and encourage people to respond, and we could share some of those responses in the next webinar?
Yes, I think that would work.
Okay, great. So we have about 2 minutes left before 10:30, and we want to be respectful of people's time. So if there are any outstanding questions or requests, please feel free to use the chat box. Kelly and I will remain on and respond to those.
And so just coaching resources, we want to highlight the online resources that are available to you all, the Circle Time Magazine, the Coaching Companion, and the DEL Coaching Toolkit. All are available and linked into the PDF that you will receive along with the webinar survey. Coach consultation, the Cultivate Learning Coach Support Team is available for coach consultation appointments, and the link for signing up is in this PDF as well. And then who to contact. So for ECAP specific policy related questions and technical assistance, you want to reach out to the assigned pre-K specialist for your program. For WELS technical assistance, you can contact qris@del.wa.gov. And for in-webinar technical assistance, that would be Mark McCarty. And then for your general coaching related questions, you can reach out to Jen and myself, and our email addresses are listed here. Please be looking for 2 follow-up emails from Jen. One email will be specific follow-up pertaining to this webinar and will contain a link to the post-webinar survey. We really appreciate the feedback that we've received after these webinars, so please keep it coming. There will also be a link to a copy of these slides and the additional documents that Susan shared with us so that we can get all those out to you. The second email will be regarding our planned webinar topics for the remainder of the year, and we've put together a proposed schedule of topics based on your feedback from the last 2 webinars, and we want you to have an opportunity to weigh in. And our next webinar is Friday, February 2nd at 9 a.m. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Happy New Year.